Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Your Favorite X-Men podcast, where I bring on a guest and we chat about their favorite Marvel mutant. Today I'm joined by Abigail, who is at Abigail Abhorrent on Twitter, and I am incredibly excited to talk about her favorite character. So with that, would you please introduce this episode's mutant?
Hi, pleasure to be here. We are going to be talking about Meggan, Meggan. I actually never found out how to pronounce her last name. I think it's Puceanu. She's also called Gloriana. If she has a code name, it is Gloriana, but I usually think of her as Meggan.
I don't think I've ever heard her referred to that name in my reading, so I've just always called her Meggan as well.
That's a pretty modern thing. It shows up in Captain Britain and MI-13 after she goes to hell.
Well, we'll have to circle back to that, but just for us to build some background, could you sort of talk about how you got into comics and X-Men comics, and then why Meggan was a character that stood out and resonated with you?
So probably like many millennials, my first introduction to X-Men was the 1990s cartoon, but I was absolutely taken in by everything about X-Men from then on. I remember my first time actually reading physical X-Men comics is a friend of mine had like a CD-ROM that had giant size X-Men. That was like my first introduction to the comics and, you know, when they're on Krakoa, that classic thing. When I got into Meggan, though, was relatively recently. I'd seen her as kind of a background character in a few things, but then recently I decided to start reading the classic Excalibur run. I started reading that because my other favorite X-Men characters are Rachel Summers and Kitty Pryde, but I was really taken in by Meggan. She's a fascinating character in what she means for, she's very transgressive in many ways and very queer-coded, and I just absolutely fell in love with her. She's a delight to read.
Yeah, she's so fantastic. She's one of those breath of fresh air characters, and when I got into Excalibur, I figured I'd give it a try because it had two of my favorites as well, that being Nightcrawler and Kitty Pryde. Rachel Summers is a favorite now too, I just hadn't read much of her at that time. But yeah, I was like really enamored by Meggan, who I'd never seen anywhere else before, but she's just so unique, and they did a masterful job crafting her personality and like what she can symbolize. And it was just really, really fun to sort of explore that during that original Excalibur run. And so with that, something I wanted to make sure to ask you about was your thoughts on the Brian Braddock and Meggan relationship, of which they are married now. But my initial reaction to Brian, which was in Excalibur, that's the first time I encountered him, was that I just did not like the guy at all. I mean, he was just...
Oh yeah, he's a total douche in that book for most of it, which I think is honestly part of the charm. Like I eventually learned to kind of love him, partly because he does improve. You can see him putting in the work. One of my favorite issues of that original Excalibur run is Meggan and Brian go out drinking together at a pub that Brian used to go to in his university days. But Brian's been trying to be sober at that point. The issue revolves around Meggan trying to kind of protect his sobriety and make sure that he can stay true to this path he set himself on. And it really kind of shows how the relationship evolves and grows over the course of that run, because that is not nearly where they were when the series starts.
Yeah, I can tell that his abrasiveness is kind of by design, and eventually I went back and I read some of the original Captain Britain stuff, and it's clear that Claremont was building on a framework that was established there for that kind of stuff, but like without much context of that originally going in. And I mean, even with some context, like I understood he was reeling off the presumed loss of his twin sister Betsy, but he was really just like in a bad way there, and I've warmed up to him maybe a tiny bit now, but for a while I was just very, very against Brian Braddock.
Yeah, he grows on you, he does. And I think part of that is, I think a big thematic through line of Excalibur is masculinity and gender in general, I suppose, but especially Brian Braddock starts out representing toxic masculinity in its most obvious form.
Yeah, and that's why I was flagged early in that book that they're not a perfect couple, and it's really a toxic relationship at the least, and at least through the beginning of that run. And as you said, they kind of work on it throughout, but I've not read the culmination of all that with like the very end of Excalibur when they start getting more 90s style and they end up getting married. But it did stand out to me because Meggan she's she's an empathic shapeshifter. She essentially molds to how she believes other people want to view her, and it's unhealthy when there's this abusive relationship dynamic going on. And that's why I really enjoyed Nightcrawler's role in this book too, because I felt like that may have had her go through this kind of crisis of faith where she could start exploring some of her true thoughts and feelings and use that to transgress away from her sort of original sort of codependent outlook. And there's also a lot of other great moments in that series too, where she's sort of uplifted by others and that helps her empower herself. Like that issue where I forget the exact context, but I think it's after the events of Inferno and she's just crying under the dock of a beach. And this group of ladies eventually finds her and they just sort of talk to her and help her out and then just show her a good time.
Yeah, she just wanders around Manhattan, just essentially blending into any group she encounters, which has its weird problematic elements because she does some racial shifting. Like there's one part where she like hangs out with a bunch of black people and gets really good at basketball, which is pretty problematic.
Yeah, I was taken aback by that the first time I read it.
You know, setting that aside briefly, most of that issue is really about her coming into her own, while at the same time, Brian, like his powers are on the fritz. Because he's away from Britain, so he doesn't have his super strength anymore. He can barely fly. And I know we're already talking about Brian a lot, and I think you really can't separate Brian and Meggan in many ways. They are, to my mind, one of the great comic book couples, just because they influence each other and make and elevate each other so much over the years. And just the way that Meggan, like, you put her around people who are positive and helpful, and she becomes more positive and helpful too, and in turn makes those other people better as well, which really resonates for me, especially, you know, for someone like me. I have like kind of that people pleaser personality, and that's really what Meggan is in its purest form. Is she tends to become what would make other people happy.
Yeah, and I think that actually can be sort of said for a few, or if not all, the characters in Excalibur, because what I really liked about that series was that, like, yes, on the surface, like, they come together just to keep the dream of like Charles Xavier and the original X-Men alive, but what it really ends up being is just like basically group therapy in a sense for them to sort of, you know, melt down their traumas and their grief and everything. And I love what you said about, you know, like Meggan being around good people helps elevate her too, because that's definitely true. And that's why I really love the dynamic that she has going on with Nightcrawler in that series, because in the beginning, anytime she's down, like Nightcrawler is such a good guy. He's like there for her or anyone really when they need it to offer some support. And I mean, he's got the sagest of sage wisdom at all times. And he delivers, I think it's probably my favorite comic panel ever, but it's that shot. It's actually my Twitter header too. It's that shot of the lighthouse, and it's when Meggan's crying and she says like she made the dream as tawdry as she is herself, and then she sort of morphs herself to be like a less attractive version of herself, or more monstrous. And then Nightcrawler has that, if there's one thing I above all others know, it's that a person cannot be judged by their looks, only their heart and soul. And yours, dear Meggan, are as lovely as the sunrise. If some people are too blind to see that, it's their shame, their loss. Sorry to read that, but I just love it so much. It's so good.
No, it's beautiful. It really is. And her relationship with Nightcrawler is fascinating because they do have so much in common, and yet there are parts of that series where Nightcrawler kind of comes off as the quote unquote capital nice guy. There is a lot of frustrating moments in the early issues of the series where Meggan does something to try to make Brian happy. Brian responds with hostility. Meggan flees in tears. Kurt comforts her. She sometimes shapeshifts to look like Kurt, which is always really cool to see. And this kind of weird moment where Kurt keeps on, it kind of feels like Kurt is just kind of hoping to, spark a get her to leave Brian, which I wouldn't have blamed her if she had at that point, because yeah, it's bad. That early issue, Brian, is not good. But I do like the way their friendship does evolve beyond him being attracted to her, and the fact that she doesn't see him as monstrous or other, because even though most of the time she looks like an attractive blonde woman, she spent a lot of her early years looking like a monster. It's the whole thing is when she was first born, she's one of the few mutants whose power like it manifested when she was born. So it was cold out and she grew fur to keep herself warm instinctively. And so from that moment on, her family and her community really saw her as a freak, something to keep hidden. And so she can relate to that because that's how Nightcrawler was born too.
Yeah, and for the reasons that you mentioned, even though I was personally rooting for it because I thought they had a lot of chemistry and their little private moments were always very, very nice and charming, ultimately, I understand why they don't end up together in that series, Meggan and Nightcrawler, and I can realize that from a narrative sense, it probably is the right idea, but that doesn't mean I didn't want it to happen really bad. But also, to the credit of Brian and Meggan, from what I've seen of them in the current era, considering all their history, they seem to have a really loving family. They have children. The toxic dynamic is no longer present.
Yeah, and I think it was it Way of X? I think there's like one scene where like Nightcrawler gets super drunk and there's a scene of him going to like up to Meggan at the Hellfire Gala and is like, I'm really happy for you, but also I still kind of have feelings for you. It's just a throwaway moment, but it made me laugh.
Yeah, I was going to mention that moment too, actually, because it was pretty funny. But speaking about the Krakoa era, and this is something I always like to ask, I'm curious if, as a Meggan fan, you are satisfied in this iteration of the X-Men with how she's been presented and used so far, and if you'd like to see her move anywhere else, or where you'd like to see her go in the future. Where does she best fit in these books?
Yeah, I think there could definitely be more done with her. She's definitely been kind of a bit player in the modern era. Like, I love the modern Excalibur and Knights of X run, and Meggan, like, she gets to do cool things there. Since the series takes place almost entirely in Otherworld, Meggan's relationship with Otherworld is really interesting because she's part fairy, and so she's more powerful there, and I think she becomes the court magician of Avalon or something afterwards. I would definitely love to see her spend more time on Krakoa itself, now that especially the Knights of X storyline is resolved, so Otherworld isn't blocked off from Krakoa anymore. Because it's interesting is she's a mutant who's married to a human being, and there's a tension kind of inherent in that. And we've seen that explored with other characters, like with Northstar and his husband. His husband also is allowed on Krakoa, but Brian is, he's kind of a little more complicated because he used to be the national hero of the UK, and now he's part of the Kingdom of Avalon, working for his brother. And then there's her, and I just want to see so much more done with her daughter, who I believe his name is Margaret, because she is a hoot and I love her.
So is that the daughter that was born around the time that X-Men Gold Annual #1 came out?
Yes, X-Men Gold Annual is about, it's an Excalibur reunion. Kurt, Rachel, and Kitty go back to the lighthouse because Meggan and Brian have had their first child. And when we get there, we find out that the child's name is Maggie. She's adorable. And we don't know why yet. It hasn't been confirmed, I think, if she's a mutant or if it's a magical thing. But Maggie is, like, even though she is a baby, she's like fully capable of speech and is very erudite and intelligent.
Yeah, she has a wonderfully intellectual conversation with Nightcrawler that really had me laughing just about the nature of existence.
Yeah, it's funny is that like she knows so many things, but also doesn't know other things. And there'll be times where she's just like goes up to Brian and is like, "Pick me up, father," and he's just like, "Okay, Maggie Mags, here you go." And she's so precocious, and I really hope we see more of her in the future. But there's this really great moment with Meggan in that book where she expresses how insecure she is around her own daughter because her daughter is so intelligent. And Meggan is, and this has been part of her character for a long time, she's illiterate. She never learned how to read. She grew up watching television, and that was the only education she had for a very long time. And she's worried that she's going to miss out on all of these things that she was hoping to, like reading for her daughter, because her daughter reads better than she does. And
they even make a little joke about that in the beginning because Meggan sends a stork with a letter attached to it to the Xavier Institute. And when Kitty is reading it, she's like, "I can barely really understand this. This is not entirely legible. And then she's like, oh, it's from Meggan. I think she's inviting us to go to the lighthouse. But I also really liked in that issue how it was exploring a lot of themes with Meggan about what she expected from life and how she sort of had those expectations based on certain things and what she wanted from her matriarchal destiny in a way and the idea of mothership that she wanted most. There's a lot of just interesting meat there. The kind of age-old, what role do I play in the world questions.
Yeah. And it's interesting of a character who Meggan's sexuality and gender presentation is so fascinating to me because she's a character who blurs gender lines constantly. She's a shapeshifter. And even though she's only ever really expressed attraction to men and only really to men for the most part, that attraction is always expressed in interesting ways, like when she makes herself look like Nightcrawler when they're flirting with one another, or in that issue where she and Brian go to that pub, she shapeshifts herself to look like Brian and pretends to be his twin brother at one point. And it's like kind of this interesting thing where she often becomes like, she kind of ends up stepping into a more dominant role kind of by accident sometimes, especially like when you look at her during Inferno, which the Excalibur Inferno tie-in is kind of weird just because it has nothing to do with what's actually happening in Inferno.
But it's so fun.
It is. It's so wacky. And Meggan's whole thing is like they fly to New York when Inferno starts because Rachel senses that baby Nathan is in trouble. And as soon as they get there, Meggan's empathic powers go into overdrive, and she pretty much immediately joins the forces of darkness and becomes the Goblin Princess. And then she gets like a dominatrix outfit and gets huge hair and sharp teeth. And she essentially like turns Brian into her sub. And it's
really funny because it's essentially mirroring the Madeline Pryor and Havoc dynamic during Inferno.
They really do. It's even down to the fact that they're both like these like blonde-haired, blue-eyed guys that just put on skimpy outfits. And I think in that case, Brian ends up fighting Kitty Pryde through like a series of movie pastiches. And it's so entertaining. And then the fallout of that when the Inferno ends and Meggan realizes what she's done is pretty devastating. But that's also what leads to her, journey through New York City and kind of regaining her confidence by just talking to people.
And that reminds me that I wanted to ask you, because I've had these concerns with Meggan and how I want her to be used and even whether she should be used or not, because my concern is at times writers will come in and use her and she'll be like a tertiary character and her only lines will just be like her shouting out Brian's name. I don't want to see her just reduced to someone that has to be attached to Brian, Like, I don't want her to be defined by his role in storylines only, because I think she can be elevated to something way greater than that, and I don't even think you have to give up, like, the matriarchal side of things to do that. Like, I recently read my first DC book, and it was Morrison's Animal Man run, and I found it incredibly refreshing that he would pretty much always just come back to his suburban family life at the end of the day after all his superhero activities, and there's just kind of an inherent charm to that I don't think Marvel likes to explore with that balance too often. But what are your thoughts on all that?
I think one way to do that would be, and this is something I've been my only major complaint about the Krakoa era, and honestly Marvel Comics in general in this day and age, is so much of what happens is centered around big crossover events and world-shattering consequences, and we never really get a chance to breathe like we would often do in back in the days of Excalibur. Like, there's an issue of Excalibur, just thinking back, where this is kind of a more Meggan-centered one, where I forget what the impetus is. It might have just been them watching a scary movie, but Meggan turns into a vampire, like with bat wings and fangs and all of that, and Excalibur literally locks her in a closet and calls Doctor Strange and is like, Meggan's become a vampire, please help. And she escapes out into London and is just hiding and going on a small mini rampage, not really hurting anybody, just getting into hijinks pretty much. And we learn so much about the characters, and the stakes aren't that high. It's just, is Meggan a vampire now? She bit Kurt. Is he going to turn into a vampire? He has fangs. Well, he's always had fangs.
Yeah. I remember that issue, and I think I don't think Doctor Strange actually ever even gets involved with it because I think they just loop in their guy whose name I forget, but he works with he's just a regular dude who works with the WHO, which is not the World Health Organization, but the Weird Happenings Organization. Is that right?
Oh yeah, what is his name? He's in like every issue of Excalibur, and I've completely forgotten about him.
I think his name is like Alistair or...
Yes, Alistair.
Okay, good. Yeah, I was like, I could be completely pulling this out of thin air, but it's good to know that my mind can hold even the most niche of X-Men facts. Speaking of the obscure, though, I wanted to bring this up and ask you about this particular issue of Excalibur, and I think it's like the B plot in it, but it is Meggan and Rachel Summers, and they're exploring, and I forget exactly what they're looking for. It might be like part of Meggan's heritage or something like that.
Yeah, they're looking for her parents. They're looking for her parents at that point.
Yes, and then we encounter these folks, and we learn about Meggan's, I don't know if it was meant to be what her true form is, but we get this energy form of Meggan that looks really beautiful on the page. It's like this nebulous light spectrum form of Meggan that is just cool.
Yeah, Meggan, it's like it never really comes up much these days, but Meggan does have a true form, which is like she's like 6 feet tall and pretty buff and got huge hair, and like the sclera of her eyes turn black, and it's really cool. And I think that's first hinted at in that kind of mini series when she and Rachel go visit that fortune teller. And it's interesting because they go on this road trip throughout Europe, and it's really formative for both of them. Because like Rachel kind of starts to regain her lost memories of the future, but Meggan kind of starts to realize that okay, she can't find her family, but she already has a family in Excalibur, and that's okay. And so she ends up becoming this, that's a big turning point for her in many ways, is her realizing that she can make her own future. She's not dependent on her past, which is, from everything I've read, pretty abusive. And then going back to that true form thing, though, my absolute favorite Meggan moment, which is when Jamie Braddock is working with Saturn, not Saturnine, but her alternate universe extra fascist counterpart. And Jamie's doing this awful, using his reality warping to do this awful body horror shit to all of Excalibur. And then, when that had happened, Meggan had been tranquilized when they brought her to him. But when she shakes it off, she realizes that her shape-shifting powers allow her to resist Jamie, who is an Omega level mutant. And she assumes her true form for the first time and then just slaps the shit out of him. And it's this amazing cathartic moment because up until then, Jamie has been this off and on again terrifying presence throughout the Excalibur run, because at that point he's totally solipsistic. He thinks he's dreaming at all times, and he can do whatever he wants and nobody can really stop him. And then Meggan just beats the crap out of him and says, you're not dreaming. This pain is real. The pain of my friends is real. Put it back and sit the hell down. And I love it.
Yeah, it's a really good character moment, and the fact that she's actually able to break away from Jamie's transforming of reality should stress the true power level of Meggan. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that power set and how her shape-shifting has evolved over time, because my first initial reading early on in the book was that it wasn't entirely in her control. Sometimes it would be reactionary shape-shifting to elements around her, but then it seems like later on, and certainly now, she's got more of a firm control of that power and can use it at will. And when I first read it, I kind of saw that reactionary transforming era of her as this kind of message on how women in society have to conform and bend to certain standards and pressures. And so that was kind of what that was meant to symbolize in a way.
Early on, in her original appearances, I think in the original Captain Britain run, I think she can't even shapeshift at all. She's just this kind of weird wolf bat monster. And kind of somewhere along the lines of that run, she gets the power to change her shape, and she ends up, the first shape she takes is her usual form, the form that she kind of assumes because she wants to be with Brian and she wants Brian to be attracted to her. And yeah, a big part of the original Excalibur run, there's so many problems caused by Meggan losing control of her shapeshifting in different ways. I mentioned that time when she accidentally turns into a vampire, and it's not just her body that changes, it's also her mind. Her empathy, her empathic powers is, she allows her to understand and feel the feelings of others. And there's another part where like she lands on a boat when they're flying. I think that's like when they're flying to the US, and like there's a bunch of sailors checking her out, and like she's thinking to herself like, they like me and I like them liking me, and she starts to become like a little more cheesecakey version of herself. And so, yeah, at that point, it is very much she becomes how other people see her. When she's around Brian, she's this very conventionally attractive kind of waifish girl. When she's with Kurt, she becomes a female version of Kurt. And by the end of that series, she does mostly get in control of it. There's great moments where she's able to transform into like a more bestial form to get, Wolverine-like senses. She takes advantage of that several times. There's a really great moment in an early issue where she like grows to be like 8 feet tall and shredded, so that she can fight toe to toe with the Juggernaut. And she does that on purpose. She's not that wasn't her, feeling what the Juggernaut's feeling and deciding to become like him. That was her using her shape-shifting powers and her ability to have connection with the Earth to stand up to a bully. And again, I keep on coming back to that issue in the pub because I think it's so emblematic of how much she grows. Is the reason she pretends to be Jamie's twin brother in that issue is there are a bunch of guys in the pub trying to convince, Brian. Why she pretends to be Brian's twin brother is there are a bunch of guys pressuring Brian to drink with them. And so the way she kind of deflects that is she shapeshifts into this version of Brian, again, entirely on purpose, and is like, my brother doesn't drink, but I'll drink with you. And she like goes drink for drink with all of these, good old pub lads. And it's a very conscious decision on her part, despite the fact that she knows that Brian's relationship with alcohol is complicated. And also she, like, I think it's said in that issue, she also doesn't drink much. She's not, but she's pounding him back for the sake of somebody else, but she's doing that of her own free will. There's no one pressuring her to do it. And I think kind of in recent years, her shape-shifting abilities have kind of been downplayed a bit. I think they put more emphasis now on her elemental powers. Like there's a lot of shots of her like shooting people with fire and ice and other stuff like that.
Yeah, I've noticed, at least during the current Knights of X run, that actually I guess is finished now, but I noticed there that Meggan seems to rely more on her elemental powers than she does her shape-shifting ones.
I think that's something she learned to do a bit later. Yeah, in that classic run, her main power is her shape-shifting, and I think she's focused more on like recent issues on her elemental powers. I am curious about how much of that is a conscious decision by the writers to say like she doesn't want to shapeshift anymore because she's in a form she's comfortable in. Because even after she learns to assume her true form, she tends to stick to her usual form because it's what she prefers. It's what she's gotten used to. So I do wonder if it is kind of a thing of her learning all these hard lessons of, okay, I've learned to keep other people out of my head and, make my body be what it wants to be. So I'm just going to not do that as much, which I think is another thing I would really like to see explored in future runs, is her kind of exploring that shape-shifting bit.
Definitely seems like that could be intentional from the writers, and I saw a great comparison somewhere that was essentially with Logan. He gets trapped in a cycle of violence because his claws and his powers are inherently violent, and it almost feels like Meggan's powers too, like the shape-shifting nature of them, led her down a similar path, but this one was a path of doing performative beauty shape-shifting often, so perhaps that's an intent to get her away from that because, as you said, she's way more comfortable with where she is now, which is a big difference from where she used to be, which was feeling more insecure and generally lonely.
Yeah, and now that I'm thinking about it, the last issue I read that really put an emphasis on her shape-shifting powers was Captain Britain in MI13 Annual, because I feel like there's like a little background that needs to do that for that, because during House of M, she sacrifices herself to keep reality from collapsing. And then we later find out, She didn't die. She went to super hell.
Gotcha. So, yeah, when you mentioned that earlier, I was curious because I think what you recommended me to read at the end of that, Meggan goes, she makes this sacrifice and she goes into this like light void basically to save everyone. And I wasn't sure where she ended up going. So, yeah, is it that she goes to hell there?
Yeah, so she somehow ends up into Marvel's hell, which is like, it's got like all sorts of different demonic rulers. And like we get a hint that she's alive in Captain Britain and MI13, where there's some being whose name I forget who like can like show people their greatest desires. And so Brian ends up being with Meggan, and then he realizes it's an illusion, but it turns out, hey, that was actually Meggan, and now she's back in hell.
That is just like not a place Meggan should be. Come on.
Oh, definitely not, because that issue begins with her talking like she ends up in front of Dormammu and Mephisto and all of those big bads and is like, why am I here? Am I supposed to be punished? And she ends up kind of opening her empathic powers and just gets warped into this like grotesque demonic like lumpen creature just by like opening herself to all of the emotions in hell.
That's really interesting because I'm sure there are probably some parallels to draw between this descent into hell and Magic's time in limbo and her dark child transformation, but I'm just not, familiar enough with this Meggan story because I haven't read the hell part to make that connection. But I definitely want to look into that in the future. With that said, for somebody who listened to this and maybe they didn't know about Meggan before and she sounds really interesting and they want to dive into the character, what are your sort of reading recommendations, the spotlight stories on her, the good places to start, etc., etc.?
The original Excalibur run, if you want to read more about Meggan, it's just honestly, it's a comic run that everyone should read. Like for the first, 75 issues or so. That original run is just so good in so many ways. And I definitely recommend reading that Captain Britain and MI13 annual #1. I think Captain Britain and MI13 is a pretty good book overall, but that annual is probably the best. It also, in addition to that Meggan in Hell storyline, there is also a scene where the team in that book, MI13, they're playing cricket, and Brian's having all these flashbacks to his early days of his relationship with Meggan, and which is very sweet. And it's kind of a funny thing where like the issue kind of ends with Brian kind of realizing he needs to let go, and then Meggan comes back like the next issue. I would also, X-Men Gold annual is also good. X-Men Gold in general, I'm not a fan of, but X-Men Gold annual is essentially just like a little epilogue at the end, for Excalibur.
And just to clarify, because I've only read that X-Men Gold annual and I've not read the actual X-Men Gold series, I assume Meggan is not a part of the core team. Is that correct? She's just in that annual?
No, she's not. But Kitty, Rachel, and Kurt are. But X-Men Gold, I wouldn't recommend in general. It's the one where they try to shoehorn a relationship between Rachel and Kurt, and it's not good. Let's see here. I think those are the main ones. I would give the original Captain Britain a look if you can get it. It's very weird. All that, there's so much weirdness that I thought was just Excalibur, which it turns out, that weirdness started in Captain Britain. I think the Age of X-Man tie-in is also pretty fun. I think it is called The Amazing Nightcrawler, which is honestly, Amazing Nightcrawler, not only is it a fun Nightcrawler series and a fun Meggan series, it also has a lot of great, other great Excalibur callbacks.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the recommendations, and thank you so much again for joining me today. Meggan is one of my favorite characters as well. Standout character from Excalibur, and I didn't think I'd get the chance to talk about her so soon, so definitely appreciate that you wanted to chat about this character.
Thank you. It's been so much fun. I love this show, and I'm really glad I could be here and talk to you about Meggan.
And thank you all for listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next episode, which will feature Danny Moonstar. All right, guys, have a great rest of your week.